Hello, good morning. It's 11 hours in Geneva. I hope you are all settled for this conversation. We're really excited that you have been able to join us today, and we're expecting, obviously, more people to join. But as our custom is, we like to start these conversations on time. My name is Muyatwa Sitali. And before we begin, I would like to just give you a few housekeeping reminders. We have simultaneous interpretation for this workshop. We have English and French. So if you look at the bottom of your screens, just choose the interpretation sign and then choose the language that you're comfortable listening in. For those that are speaking, before you speak, choose the language that you will be using to speak in, so that the interpreters would be able to pick you from the right language. And then we would like to ask everybody who's joined to please add your name, organization, and country where you're joining from. Please put that information in the chat. May I ask that we all keep our lines on mute so that we are able to hear the speakers. And if you're not speaking, please kindly put your line on mute. If you have a question, we have built in several Q&A opportunities throughout the workshop, but at any time, feel free to add them in the chat as well. Could I have the next slide? So this is our agenda for today. This workshop is made possible thanks to the support of and efforts of the civil society partners in the SWA partnership. And our civil society partners are calling attention to the human rights aspects of water, sanitation, and sanitation to highlight the impacts of climate change on individuals and communities. One of the key messages from the SWA CSO constituency at the sector ministers meeting, which took place in Jakarta in May, one of the key messages is 100% transparency and 0% corruption in all WASH investments, including climate finance. So we are meeting today to identify entry points in climate finance architecture to strengthen these efforts and strategies in collaboration with CSO partner Water Integrity Network. We also welcome World Water Resources Institute to the workshop. We are also joined by our CSO, or by our SWA climate advisor, Jose Hesti Canuto, who will be speaking shortly. And in terms of the agenda, the workshop is divided into 3 parts, as you'll be able to see on the screen. First, we'll have the scene setting to introduce fundamental concepts in the climate finance architecture, as well as potential integrity risks and entry points for advocacy. The second part is where we will discuss case studies and how non-government actors can apply these concepts to a real-life situation. Third, we will present the tools and resources to boost the advocacy efforts and outreach efforts that are currently underway. And then we will have some closing remarks by the SWA Steering Committee Vice Chair, Sareen Malik. And at this point, I would like to invite to the floor our presenters. We will get into the next part of the agenda. Could we have the next slide, please? And at this point, I would like to invite Jose Hesti to take us through this climate finance in terms of the importance and of strengthening accountability and integrity. And this is part of the scene setting. Jose, over to you.
Thank you very much, Itali. Just to check that you can hear me well and the translation is working well as well.
Yes, we can hear you well, Jose. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So thanks. Yeah, here to open a little bit and provide a short introduction to this very important session. And the topic is climate finance and the importance of strengthening accountability and integrity. So let me start by reminding ourselves that under the Paris Agreement, developed countries committed to deliver at least 100 billion US dollars in financing from both public and private sources between 2020 and 2025. And this is supposed to be addressing both mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. What we know, however, is that when we met last year at COP26 in Glasgow, it was noted that this goal of reaching this 100 billion has not yet been met. And indeed, at the moment, countries are lagging behind with this commitment, and there is no common formula as to how much of this individual countries should be providing, and what is the contribution between public and private, etc. So at the moment, we know that development banks, aid agencies, foundations, and some commercial and private sector sources have tended to take up the bulk of what is generally considered climate finance. In addition, multilateral institutions such as the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and others that we will see during the working session today, have been used to directly fund climate change activities. Also, national bilateral climate financing initiatives represent an emerging source of funding in both developed and developing countries. Mostly they remain focused on mitigation. So in recent years as well, the expanded use of verified green bonds, such as the climate water bonds, have signaled an increasing global appetite for municipal and private sector investment in debt capital markets for climate change. The session today focuses on climate financing for adaptation, but let me share with you some climate financing facts to put things a little bit into perspective. One of the key facts, right, is that climate finance has steadily increased over the last decade, and it has reached a peak of $632 billion in 2020. But you may wonder who is behind those 632 billion. I remember this before. I was referring to 100 billions. That's the commitment for developing countries. Now we are talking about the global climate financing that obviously goes beyond those 100 billion that haven't been met yet. So I'm talking now about the global expenditure of 632 billion globally. And here it's important to remark that the public sector accounted for almost half of that, 321 billion, of tracked climate finance. And development finance institutions, the DFIs, continue to provide the majority of the public finance, almost 70%. The other half is from the private sector. And yeah, well, this is a kind of an overall figure, right? I think it's also important to make very clear from the beginning the split of climate financing for mitigation versus adaptation. Since this session is focusing on adaptation, I want you to get the idea that at the moment over 90% of total climate financing is dedicated to mitigation. The trend is growing for adaptation, but at the moment, the global climate finance for adaptation, it only represents 7% of the global finance. And as I said, this is changing. When it comes to adaptation, we will see during our session today that the water sector benefits of an interesting amount of climate finance for adaptation. But I want to remark here that if we zoom in what the water sector climate financing for adaptation, how is that spent, we will see that basic water supply, sanitation, and hygiene is only 10%, is a small amount of the total climate financing for adaptation in the water sector. I want to highlight that the topic that we're discussing today is extremely important. And let me tell you that it fits very well with what are the expected negotiations in a couple of weeks in COP in Egypt, in COP27. Let me just tell you, and this is a quote from the COP27 presidency, the Egyptian presidency, to highlight the importance of our session today. The Egyptian presidency is telling us, The importance of adequacy and predictivity of climate finance is key to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. To this end, there is a need for enhanced transparency of finance flows and facilitated access to meet the needs of developing countries, especially Africa, the less developed countries, and small island development states. The existing commitments and pledges announced all the way from all the COPs from Copenhagen to last year in Glasgow require follow-up in order to provide clarity as to where we are and what more needs to be done. So progress on delivery of the annual 100 billion commitment that I have mentioned before will build more trust between developed and developing countries, showing that actual commitments are being fulfilled. So from our side in SWA, I will finish just here telling you that we have coordinated WASH stakeholders at the global level and provided inputs and feedback to the recently passed Green Climate Fund water security guidelines. Our core objective has been to make sure that WASH, water supply, sanitation, and hygiene is well reflected in those guidelines. And we are making a special emphasis on the discussion on whether climate funds are effectively reaching the less developed countries and the most vulnerable populations. The other lens that we are interested in discussing further is, as I was mentioning before, the allocation of climate financing to basic services such as water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. This is not only a development question, and our sector has an enormous need for a fair share of climate financing. And I will leave it here.
Jose, fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. This is a really interesting. You've taken us through the amounts that are being mentioned as being available, and then also what our role could be and the contributions that we've made so far. We already have a question in the chat, so I will ask you to also go in the chat and respond to that question, but I'll give you a chance for you to respond to this at some point verbally. Just to encourage people, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. For those of you that have joined in the last few minutes, if please do put your name, organization, and country in the chat as well. I believe the slides have been put they've been posted in the chat as well, the French version of the slides. So in case you are more comfortable with French, you could also follow the slides in French. Could we move to the next slide? We will get a presentation now from our colleagues at Water Integrity Network, and we'll start with Daniela, and she will then pass on the floor to Binayak. Daniela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sitali. And yeah, before starting our presentation, we would like to greet all the participants. It's a pleasure for us from WIN to organize this webinar with SWA and to discuss a little bit more of how, from the work you are doing as civil society organizations, you can promote a higher integrity and push for a higher accountability in the finance of climate adaptation. Next slide, please. So to start, and before we deepen into the topic, it was a very interesting introduction as well by Jose, discussing a little bit the data, and also Binayak is going to deepen a little bit in the data, in the information and the amount of finances and resources that are going to climate finance and how this poses some integrity risks. But before that, we would like to introduce very briefly what's the Integrity Network, what's our work, and what are we doing. So basically, we focus our work in three main outcomes. First, we try to advocate for political and for social action in the water and sanitation sector. We try to raise awareness of which are the benefits of integrity and how we can train different stakeholders from the water and sanitation sector, but also from other sectors, to start understanding which are the grievances, which are the vulnerabilities of the sector in terms of integrity and how we can face them. On the second hand, we work collectively with our partners and with multi-stakeholder platforms and initiatives in order to promote a collective action, to start connecting actors, in order to share knowledge, to generate these peer-to-peer exchanges, and also to fight together against these failures of integrity that can happen in the sector. And finally, we base all our work in the generation of evidence. We try to base all our practices or the tools we're developing, and which we will be discussing later today, in sound evidence and in practical evidence that can help us assess and research about which are the risks in terms of integrity in the sector and how we can develop different approaches to face these risks, to mitigate them, and to develop different strategies. Next, please. So to start talking about failures of integrity and corruption, specifically in the finance of climate adaptation, first we need to put a little bit of background of what do we understand as corruption and what do we understand as integrity in the water and sanitation sector. So according to Transparency International, corruption can be defined as the abuse of entrusted power for a private gain. It can take different phases, but in general, it can be classified as grand corruption, petty corruption, or political corruption. When we're talking about grand corruption, basically, we're talking about the diversion of a big amount of resources, and we're also talking about a corruption that's systemic and has been embedded within society and within different systems and institutions, within a context, within a region, or within a country. When we're talking about petty corruption, basically we refer to the corruption that can be faced by individuals, either in their interactions with different institutions, they can be public or private, or in their day-to-day life. And when we talk about political corruption, basically we're talking about the diverting of funds to achieve certain political gains. These political gains can include the using of resources to consolidate power, but also the uses of resources to gain more votes, among other diversions of resources and among other uses of this abuse of entrusted power. When we talk about integrity specifically also in the water and sanitation sector, we are talking basically of using these vested powers and resources in an ethical and in an honest manner. All of this in order to ensure that services and resources basically go where they are intended. Basically, they achieve the objectives and the outcomes they were created for, and also with a very big focus on achieving the most vulnerable and the most marginalized communities in order to guarantee their access to water and sanitation and their management of resources in a very sustainable and integral manner. For this, and from this platform and this perspective that we have developed from WIN, we understand integrity as building up on transparency, building up on accountability, building up or generating and pushing for a higher participation of different stakeholders, and also implementing an anti-corruption strong and rigorous framework. Next slide, please. So what we have seen from the research and from the work we're doing with different stakeholders and different partners worldwide is that integrity risks can happen across all phases of different projects. So specifically, and this is an example of water service delivery, we have identified different types of risks that can happen from the earliest stages that come from allocation until the operation of water service delivery projects. So this can include in the allocation, for example, risks associated with funds that are allocated to privilege or to benefit primarily villages of family or friends. Also funds that are allocated to ghost villages and are embezzled in order to be captured by certain private interests of the people that are taking these decisions and allocating the resources. In terms of procurement, we have identified risks that are aligned or that happen in terms of local power and community politics. Also in terms of implementing tendering processes that are controlled by cartels and arbitrary tariff setting, among other risks that can happen in procurement practices. In terms of construction, we can put this very quickly, but we have identified risks that include substandard and cheaper materials. So basically, they give you cheaper materials for the same price, and then the rest of the money or the rest of the resources is being lost or is being stolen or captured. And also the building of structures that are not according to the specifications or the bid. Later, we'll also see which are the impacts of these risks. In terms of service delivery, we have identified in terms of petty corruption, for example, bribes demanded to access services or to give services to certain population, And also we have seen that one of the main impacts in terms of service delivery is that vulnerable communities and marginalized populations are always the ones that are mostly left behind. And finally, in terms of operations, we have seen how corruption diverts the resources from operations, from maintenance, and basically we have seen risks associated with lack of accountability and poor maintenance of facilities, because probably it's not that easy to install or to capture resources in terms of maintenance, that when you are allocating or when you are building a new project, for example. And we have also seen risks associated with the lack of control over funds that are meant for operations, for repairs, and where money starts disappearing. And this is key because as we're going to see specifically for the climate adaptation sector, the development of these projects also may have or may also present the risks that we have just seen across different phases of a project delivery. Next, please. So now I'll pass the word to Vinayak to deepen a little bit more on this linkages between water and climate.
Thanks, Daniela. Thanks, Jose. I'll pick up from where both of you stopped. To mention that, like, when we are talking in relation to climate and water, WASH, what is important to consider is that, like, we are discussing about the implications not just for WASH, but it is cross-sectoral. So you can see that, like, natural disasters are heavily impacted by, or water is getting heavily impacted because of that. Energy and hydropower, food and agriculture, sanitation, wastewater, environment. So water is very central to all of these. And here, as our participants here are mostly from the CSOs today, one of the important things that CSOs need to pick up the role of advocacy for integrity and climate justice, and to ensure that communities and CSOs themselves are empowered to undertake those measures. This is very important because the WASH sector came in late into the climate discourse, and this is what we are trying to pick up now. Next slide, please. So going back to what Jose started with, what I'd like to share is that this slide is, I think, the text is a bit small here, but I'd like to mention that there are some key finance actors, generally in the climate finance architecture, which Jose was already talking about. Among them, the Green Climate Fund, which was established in 2010, is one of the most recent and most important climate funds. They're on the way to become one of the largest climate funds, or rather funding component in the global development and climate sector. They are part of the UNFCCC. That's how it was established. Then you have Adaptation Fund, which was established in 2009, and they are also playing an important role in terms of supporting government and entities. They're also supported by government and private donors. Then there is the Global Environment Facility, which probably some of you are already aware of, which has been functioning for a quite long time. Their focus is not only on climate, but also environmental and other issues. There is the Climate Investment Funds, which has also been established, and that also have support from 14 donor countries. And they have a focus on mitigation and adaptation. There are also, so these are some of the key global funds that are around, but apart from that, there are also the multilateral development banks who have been supporting development for a long time, for decades. For example, they are the Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, African Development Bank. They're among those. Then there are the bilateral level donors, which a lot of you CSOs probably are more acquainted with, because in countries you have the bilateral donors coming from different countries who are supporting such processes. And there, for example, our GIZ is one of them, which is part of it. And then apart from that, there are also specific what you call European funds, which are going into climate projects. Like there is the Global Climate Partnership Fund or the Norway's Institutional Forest Climate Initiative. Apart from that, there are many countries, and here I'm just mentioning about the developing countries also who have taken their own initiative on climate funds, for example, in Brazil, Bangladesh, Benin, Cambodia, Ethiopia, etc. Next slide, please. So now what I would like to talk about specifically to water. So the recent studies show that a lot of the funds that are coming for the water sector is related to adaptation, because adaptation is very crucial when it comes to climate related, like how to address the impacts of climate change. And here, if you see that 3 sectors linked to water absorb almost 80% of all funding. And this includes water and wastewater, disaster risk, and natural resource management. 39% of Green Climate Fund projects are water related. At the moment, the GCF has the largest chunk of water related funding. Next slide, please. Then you can see, I mean, it's a bit small there, but what I'd like to mention is that in terms of the sectors mentioned for adaptation components, water is receiving or is in the process of receiving the highest amount of funds when it comes to infrastructure projects. This is followed by agriculture. You can also note that agriculture is also very strongly related to water. Next slide, please. So here we have some examples of evidence of poor integrity and corruption in projects. We focus a little bit on the early stages. We have probably, I mean, Daniela mentioned also looked at more in a water, what we call the value system, that in the implementation stage, there are many instances we are aware of malpractices, fraud. But here we're trying to highlight also some from known publications, etc., what can happen in the early stages of projects. For example, evidence that irrigation system in Guatemala were developed without feasibility studies, and it led to unjustified higher prices. Then there is, in relation to planning, design that did not take into account the climate change impact, resulted in providing non-operational systems in Malawi, for example, fraudulent land acquisition. That's an example from Bangkok for wastewater projects. Poor upstream planning again. And this is an example about a dam in Uganda. Outdated sensors, compromise in design. So what I'm trying to say from these examples are that, like, corruption does not always mean the exchange of financial resources, money, but it also can be looking at it a bit broadly, like poor design, poor planning because of vested interests and other reasons. Next slide, please. So the integrity implications for water are quite a few things. And so it is important to look at it that vast sums of money are now being invested to mitigate and adapt to climate change across sectors. However, corruption within climate finance threatens to derail these processes. Both the impact of climate change as well as the lack of integrity affects mostly the vulnerable communities, which is an issue that the climate discourse has been discussing for a long time, and water is very important because those are some of the basic human rights which gets affected. There are new actors. So a lot of the CSOs have been working on the space of WASH here, but now probably we'll also notice that there are new actors, new financiers who are coming in for with climate funds. And how do you engage with them is also very crucial, because this complicates the process of having more multiple organizations already in a fragmented sector, like the water and sanitation sector. 40% of all climate-related overseas development assistance is received by initiatives in countries among the riskiest places in the world for corruption, according to U4. Lack of participation of vulnerable communities and civil society poses risks, and this is already something which we are noticing. And in this second part of today, we will be also sharing some examples which will show, like, the lack of participation of civil society organizations, inadequate traceability of climate funds, especially in the national and local public finance systems. Next slide, please. So What I would like to also mention is that like there are other integrity implications specifically on adaptation. As mentioned earlier, a lot of the funds for water projects are going to come for infrastructure. So large-scale infrastructure adaptation projects are prone to corruption, and integrity risks are there at all stages, from planning, designing, allocation, procurement, implementation, operations, reporting, and monitoring. Here it is important from the WASH perspective to consider that like how can CSOs play a role in across all the stages. Countries sometimes lack the capacity and structure required to channel funds, as well as to carry out planning and implementation of adaptation projects. Mainstreaming specific adaptation measures into national development planning is hampered by the problem of institutional traps. And this comes from some studies, like there is the capture of the agenda by the technical elite and the state, single level of centralized concentration of capacities, organizational fragmentation, and overemphasis on reactive crisis management, not planning, not undertaking risk management early on, for instance. Bribery, clientelism, which I think Daniela already mentioned about, are also still existing. Next slide, please. So a couple of other things which you want to pull out here, like what is overlooked. Many projects can be accepted through the lens of climate change adaptation. However, if there are no clear and standardized criteria in place to assess which quality, then these projects can be accepted, although they may affect pre-existing social and environmental conditions and leading to maladaptation. So this is something which you are looking at closely now, the issue of maladaptation. It's something you need to take precautionary measures now, because otherwise there are impacts which will be only noticed probably even a decade down, and then it is obviously contributing to more climate crisis. Then if you look at the basic human needs, the missing WASH. This is important for us to know that most of the climate funds allocated and the discourse focuses on big projects, big infrastructure, but does not take into consideration issues of human rights and the basic needs of drinking water, sanitation, health, housing, education for the people. This is where I think our conversation today should take forward from. And then obviously I mentioned about risk analysis, new risks arising which are poorly assessed or addressed, which means these risks threaten to derail progress towards resilience. And just to mention that only 2% of climate funds reach the vulnerable communities. And it is estimated that 10% of climate finance is prioritized at the local level disbursement. Next slide, please. So now these are some of the issues that are there, some which are overlooked. And now I'd like to share a couple of mechanisms that have been in place that can support CSOs. I'm not aware, but many of you probably are already aware of it. And it would be good to know how many of you actually know about these mechanisms. And these are in place from different climate finance agencies. For instance, we have all multilateral climate funds support country-level stakeholder engagement to some extent. For instance, there is a long-term special support program for the engagement of indigenous people and local communities, including a dedicated grant mechanism to support their role in climate projects. What I also want to mention is that while there is guidance available for stakeholder engagement to develop national climate strategies and for engagement with climate funds, the specifics of such processes are not codified and are left to the national processes and the country governments instead. And this is where probably the CSOs need to engage more. Readiness, support, and opportunities to strengthen institutional capacities to access climate finance are made available to many countries, to various development partners. There is the need for building more capacities, the need to understand what does it mean by climate finance, what does it mean by climate adaptation, how can we access the funds, how can we ensure that the funds are best utilized. For instance, Adaptation Fund implements a readiness program for climate finance. The GIZ has implemented the climate finance readiness program also, and the GCF support program is also there, which can be accessed in countries directly without going through the accredited entities. There are complaint and redressal mechanisms in place also. For example, the GCF provides for a complaint mechanism to be established at the level of implementary or executing entities. In addition, GCF on their website, and there are other mechanisms which there can be reporting of wrongdoings, etc., directly, and that can there is also the mechanism of whistleblower protection in place. Next slide, please. So I will now pass on again to Daniela so that she can continue from there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinaya, for this overview. And just to complement on these mechanisms that already exist for CSOs, we have identified from our work what is missing and what is where we would have to focus as well to continue strengthening these capacities of oversight, but also of pushing for advocacy and higher transparency in climate finance adaptation in the water and sanitation sector. So the first thing we have identified is that it's the need of a breakdown of climate finance architecture and the need to incorporate integrity elements from the get-go or from the design of the projects. When a project is being planned, there from the beginning, this integrity perspectives and this climate finance architecture should be considered, and also CSOs and communities should be part of this process, overseeing how the planning is gone and where some integrity risks or failures could happen. On the other hand, it is key to understand the multi-stakeholder process in place. It is key to understand which are the powers in place, which are the stakes that are in place, what it's the negotiation that can take place, and also how to establish different accountability mechanisms to set those responsible and accountable for the management of the resources and for the implementation of the actions. It is key to understand and to take into account which are the spillover effects and how to identify them and how to be transparent about them. Something that we have also identified that it's key is that until now, the climate finance architecture is very center oriented and it's very centered organized. So basically top-down approaches have been implemented in which communities, civil society organizations, and local groups don't have a big say. So it is key to generate bottom-up approaches in which participatory mechanisms and different channels to hear and to understand which are the perspectives from the ground are taken into account and are considered in the design and the implementation of the programs. And finally, it is key to define different mechanisms to involve the communities and the civil society. So Vinayak just mentioned very briefly on the mechanisms that exist, this guidance for stakeholders in terms of consultation and an engagement, but the specifics are missing. So this guidance is very general, but the specifics are missing in terms of who are you going to engage, how are going to be engaged, and in which stages. So it is key to work on these specificities in this guidance. On the other hand, it is key to guarantee the participation of both vulnerable communities and also civil society organizations in order to guarantee if a project is suitable, the viability of a project, and how sustainable this water project may be. And finally, it is key that local communities continue being positioned as recipients, but also that are considered are actors that are capable of shaping their own adaptation measures. So not seen only as the beneficiaries of the process or of the projects, but also seen as key actors in terms of the decision making and in terms of the planning of this projects. Before we pass to the next slide, because I saw one of the comments also in the chat was referred to this, and this came from a brief that we developed with some of our partners, is that one thing that is key in this climate finance of the water and sanitation sector is that we consider the whole stages of a project. So that the consultation and the involvement of civil society organizations is considered from the beginning, but it doesn't disappear there, and it has to be continuous through the oversight of the implementation and of the monitoring and the supervision of these projects. Next slide, please. I'll do this very quickly because I don't know if we're running out of time, but we have identified a good practice in this direction from a project on 2017 from GCF that was approved in the Tina River Hydropower Development Project, and basically was aiming to help the Solomon Islands to transit from diesel-generated power to hydropower. And one of the key elements of this project is that they included a provision of a benefit sharing fund to the surrounding communities and to the community-based organization in order for them to access to the benefits of the project, but also to include direct management responsibilities of the available funds for these communities. So this is key because they are not seen only as the beneficiaries, but they are also key decision makers in the implementation and in the management of the project itself. On the other hand, and a very quick example, it's a project that was led by CSOs and communities in Bangladesh with a very key and a strong support from media, in which they exposed the compromise in the design and in the construction of flood embankments. And this can also be referred to the case that Vinayak was talking about before, in the compromise in the design of specific projects in the water and sanitation sector in Bangladesh. Next slide, please.
Daniela, if I could just make a quick intervention, the beauty of good things is that you want to hear more and more of it. In terms of time, we are very pressed. So if you could take maybe a minute on recommendations, and there's also a lot of comments, and I'm glad you've answered some of the questions already. So if you could take a minute to conclude the recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sitali, and apologies that we took a little bit longer. So very quickly on the recommendations, we have already mentioned several of them. The first one is the need of strengthening the participation of vulnerable communities and the civil society in the prioritization, the planning, and the implementation of the projects. So we said it's not only in the planning, it's not only in the design, but it's through all the value chain of a project. Also, it is very key to strengthen your capacity and your work as watchdogs to oversee the whole process, which is key, and is particularly key in the water and sanitation sector, where the responsibilities and the roles are scattered between so many entities and between so many stakeholders. So there you develop, or you have a key responsibility acting as watchdogs and guaranteeing this accountability process. And very quickly, it's also important that you continue encouraging and that you continue demanding for high standards in terms of accountability and transparency, mainly of transparency and of publishing on information that is key and that should be accessible to state organization, to communities, and to civil society itself. And just to close and to open a door also for when we're going to discuss the tools, is that so many tools have been developed from the climate environment, from the transparency environment, from the water and sanitation sector environment. And I think this is an invitation to start identifying the good things that we have from every sector and to bring everything together and to take advantage of all the processes and mechanisms that are in place. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniela. So Daniela and Binayak, this has been a fantastic presentation. I actually don't know how you've done the magic where you are. It looks like you're in different rooms, but we see you on one screen, so fantastic. I think you gave us a lot of information that is good for us to digest and to contribute to the discussions. I very much like the fact that you also touched on some good practices, and you helped us a lot because you even touched on some of the questions that came in the chat about how CSOs can be involved and at what point of the process can they be involved. You've touched on what's missing in the process already. There was a question about the governance structures and systems, and I think you touched on that, but if you want to elaborate more on that, I could give you a minute. So let me know if you want to elaborate more on this question around the governance structure and how it includes civil society. Is that something you might want to address? So Daniela and Binayak, there was a question about, does the existing sort of structure or governance mechanisms, to what extent do they incorporate civil society? I think you touched on this, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on it.
So generally, there has been a lot of engagement from the civil society organizations when it comes to climate-related discussion and discourse. We have seen this over the years in COP, etc. But you also will notice that they're not always part of the main discussion in COP. They're always the side discussion, the side events. So this is very important to note that like that way, like the inclusivity is not very strong. And when it comes to WASH, probably with a platform like SWA, the civil society organizations umbrella should be pushing for more engagement. I think this is very crucial. And finally, I think talking on WASH, because WASH is something which has been ignored for a long time in the climate discourse.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much, Binayak. There were two questions from Barbara, and Jose has responded to those. So just also in the interest of time, we'll move to Nisha. The two questions from Barbara were mostly around the financing and also the fact that part of this is also, even if it might be highly concessional, but part of it is actually debt in terms of the financing. So, and Jose responded to that in the chat, which was great. Nisha, welcome to this conversation. We're really grateful that you made the time to join us. You're joining us from the World Resources Institute, and would like you to share with us the entry points for CSOs to ensure accountability in climate adaptation. And you have 5 minutes to give us these entry points. Over to you, Nisha.
Thanks very much, Sitali, and thanks very much for having me here today. As Sitali mentioned, my name is Nisha Krishnan. I lead our climate resilience portfolio for our World Resources Institute Africa regional office. I could have the next slide, please. I wanted to give a little background as to where the inspiration for our accountability work came from. We actually started thinking about climate finance accountability even before the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. It was based on trying to understand whether this obviously still to be fulfilled pledge of 100 billion per year was going where it was going and whether it was actually reaching the most vulnerable communities which it's intended to reach. Did it actually empower these communities to prioritize their own adaptation needs? Did it have impact over time? What are the lessons learned from these investments, and were these investments actually, these lessons actually being integrated into future planning cycles? And was it actually affecting even domestic programming and planning, right? And so a lot of what has already been covered by Binayak and others, I think, is something that we were also concerned about from an adaptation perspective. And then I also wanted to sort of touch upon the fact is that we have first really focused on international flows, right? And this is obviously pre-2015, so there is very limited international flows at that point, but quickly realized that it was only one part of the full climate finance architecture, that domestic resources, that budgets in general within these countries, within developing countries in particular, were also going to adaptation, even if it wasn't defined as climate finance or adaptation. And so our work started to encompass both aspects. So what was international finance doing within countries, and how were domestic resources also being used or not being used properly to address climate adaptation needs? On thinking through how off-budget and on-budget resources were being developed. So what is the role of the private sector in doing off-budget investments? What is the role of climate funds? As Vinayak mentioned, many countries actually have separate climate funds that they have hosted that are off-budget, so you can't actually track resources as well or hold them accountable as easily as others, but it's sort of focused on both of those pieces. The other thing that I would mention is that our work really focused on more than just the quantity of resources, right? So it is coming again to the scope for decision-making power. Are the resources being invested loans or grants? I think I saw something in the chat from Barbara about the composition of resources. Is this long-term investments? Are these short-term? What are the reporting burdensome requirements? Is this actually a reflection of community priorities? So back to the point from Daniela about top-down versus bottom-up pieces. And then this question of access. Who actually has access to resources to plan and invest in adaptation? Is it, do local level communities actually have access to this? And actually, most climate funds are not accessible directly by communities. They actually have to go through government. So this notion that climate finance is actually accessible by communities is something that we still have to work out. And then also obviously the complications of actually applying, right? So going through the proposal writing process, establishing a climate rationale, particularly for the GCF, that basically says we will only finance climate related initiatives, not the development side. So there are plenty of complications about how we can actually access climate finance that also needs to be held accountable for the process. This actually led to us developing a common understanding of what locally led adaptation meant. And with many partners from around the world, we've developed a set of 8 principles that locally led adaptation needed to encompass. And I think this is quite relevant for some of the topics that you've just talked about today. This included things like devolution. Does this address underlying structural inequities when we talk about adaptation? Is this patient and predictable financing? So is this just a one-off investment, or is there actually ability to build capacity over time in local communities to understand priorities, to understand climate science, and to actually figure out what they need within their planning and programming cycles. And then to really think about flexibility, right? Even if you have larger infrastructure investments, there is that risk of maladaptation, as Vinayak said. And so is there ability to influence the planning and the monitoring aspects of this such that it is actually flexible and responding to the needs as climate is changing, as society's needs are changing. And then the need for actual collaboration across anyone who's doing adaptation work. But following through with all of this obviously requires transparency and accountability. And accountability, I think, still needs to be defined, right? And is this a conversation? And this is a conversation between multi-parties. And so it is not just a one-way system of transparency and accountability, but requires constant engagement over time. I'd also say that we basically realized, obviously, asking this question of whether money has reached the most vulnerable and whether decision-making power is available is really a hard question to ask. And that there's really a need for the partnerships that Daniela mentioned around independent actors across the system. And if you could get to the next slide, I will actually start talking about some entry points. I wanted to ask really quickly, I think the entry points very much depend on what are the intended objectives of this engagement and accountability conversation. Is it to improve the prioritization and planning? And I would say it goes beyond the investment cycle, and it goes beyond to sort of the strategies, right, that governments and countries and communities are developing. How does WASH fit in there? How does adaptation fit in there? And it really needs to be much more the upstream aspects of it rather than just one-off investments. Is the accountability engagement to figure out whether this actually reflects community needs? Is it about better inclusion of or better sort of highlighting of the fact that there's no direct access to funds? So even if you have plans and infrastructure investments, are there no funds behind it? Who do we hold accountable for that? And if you could go to the next slide, I'm trying to get through this faster since I realize I only have 5 minutes and not 15 anymore. I think depending on the objectives you have, the entry points could include multiple aspects, right? So one is engaging with donors. And as Vinayak mentioned, in COPs, often there are very limited points of engagement, but there are other ways to engage donors with sort of shadow reports, with actual engagement in their programming cycles. And most donors actually have open comment periods for their strategies. And I think engaging with them there is really helpful. I think the other piece that I would say here is that donors often work through intermediaries, and we haven't talked about how intermediaries within the adaptation and climate finance system actually kind of skews power sort of dynamics, and that the fact that intermediaries themselves have to be held accountable. So a lot of the times, for example, the GCF is an intermediary, right? They're an intermediary between bilateral donors and countries and communities. You might have country level climate change funds that act as intermediaries, or you might have these other sort of philanthropic organizations that have intermediaries to get to the community level. And so engaging with them and holding them accountable is also part of the entry point. The other piece, as you've already mentioned, is sort of the planning budgeting cycle of countries and districts. And so the fact that we need to influence multi-year planning strategies. So not just the water sector, but what do national adaptation plans say? What do NDC say about WASH? And how do we actually engage with those consultation processes such that those sort of not just CSO priorities are reflected, but actually community priorities. The other engagement point we've seen is actually members of parliament and legislatures, where there are independent legislatures, and using that entry point to actually reflect where investments could be made, where priorities are not being reflected, and the same thing with local planning agencies as well as plans as well. The other piece that you've already covered is obviously procurement, and procurement now matters even more because of the materials that are potentially non-climate resilient that could emit emissions. So it goes beyond sort of adaptation, but really climate in general. How do we think about the services provided? How do we think about design standards within procurement? And I think those are all pieces where it might not be climate finance specifically, but it influences how finance and adaptation is actually spent. The entry points around performance monitoring and follow-up. So the longer term impact analysis, how do we actually make sure that the lessons learned from these investments are actually sent back into the prioritization, the planning strategies going forward. And then I wanted to mention two things. One that I've forgotten to put on the slide, but the other piece is around shadow reports. So for example, the Oxfams of the world are putting out shadow climate finance reports that question what donors are spending on, that question what domestic governments are spending on their own resources, from their own resources on adaptation, right? So is this actually something that, you know, we can hold, can we hold these actors accountable for what they're spending on and who they're spending it for? And are there sort of discrepancies in what we're showing as impact and what is spent? The other piece I would say is that there are citizens' budgets being published, citizens' climate budgets being published in collaboration with budget advocacy groups. So are investments actually being prioritized? Who are they being prioritized for? How do they include climate impacts? The point that is not on the slide that I'd like to make is also that there is an active sort of CSO engagement around adaptation and climate impacts through the judiciary system and other sort of authorities within sort of a functioning governance system. I think there's also been a question about governance here, but you know, you can also leverage judiciary systems to actually file cases. For example, in Kenya a couple of years ago, when the Climate Change Commission was set up, there was actually a case filed by Transparency International and others here that questioned the composition of that climate commission and who was sitting on there. So how do you actually bring in the accountability? How do you actually leverage an existing judiciary system that is relatively strong or not, but to sort of bring this out into the public about here are ways where things are going wrong and are not necessarily according to the laws and legal structures of the country. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, the reason why there's so many entry points and so much confusion is that it's really not straightforward. Money does not flow in a linear fashion. It flows through multiple sort of entry points and exit points. Governance is not sort of straightforward either. There's we just have to think about what does this political economy here look like? Who are the vested interests, as Vinayak had already said, that we need to engage with and actually sort of act with and work with to actually move this agenda forward, right? So next slide, please. This is kind of what we've learned as some of the steps that we need to use based on our work in Ethiopia, Uganda, Nepal, Zambia, and a couple other countries around what do we need to really help set up an accountability system. One is to scope the current mechanisms for financing, for actually designing adaptation activities or WASH activities in this case, and then actually to engage, to figure out the political economy analysis, right? So who are the vested interests, who are the stakeholders in this process, and how might we influence and hold them accountable with the data that we have access to? Second piece this will really help with is the identification of entry points for engagement. So again, who do you need to engage with? How do you get communities involved? You know, are there budget, finance, and policy data that you can use to make the case. Because I think one of the things that I've learned through this work is that often advocacy for advocacy's sake falls on deaf ears, but having evidence, however limited and restricted, is actually helpful in making that case, right? You then have actual evidence to sort of to move this forward. The other piece that I would say that is necessary to do with the communities that you're working with and the other CSOs that you're working with is actually define what is adaptation to this community and to this investment or plan. I don't think Jose mentioned this, but there is no actual definition for climate finance, and there is no one definition for adaptation finance either. So a lot of communities and countries are actually in this process of defining it and actually tracking it. And I think there needs to be something like that for the WASH community as well, for you to be able to engage systematically across the different engagements that you have. And the last two pieces are really much more about the fact that this is not just a one organizational sort of piece or one network piece, but the fact is that all CSOs need to be sort of working together to bring this accountability agenda forward. So one is how do we train ourselves to make sure that we have access to the right data, we understand how to interpret it, how do we actually understand these sort of engagement steps, what are sort of lessons we've learned. And so I think part of this is this workshop actually. And then how do you actually bring other actors? So communities, how do you bring the media in? How do you bring and work with non-traditional partners like budget organizations, budget advocacy organizations? How do you work with the Transparency Internationals of the world to really bring this forward? Next slide, please. I had made some changes to the slide, but so one is obviously engaging multiple parts of government, and that's already come up. The fact that climate in particular sits across multiple government ministries and agencies, and it's not in one specific someone's specific responsibility, and which makes it harder to think about adaptation and WASH activities actually. It also requires engagement, I think, often with finance ministries and ministries of economy themselves, which often isn't who we engage with. And so the extent to which we can find entry points and other organizations who will work with them to influence them and bring them along is part of this. I would also say that particularly from our work in Ethiopia, we may not want to call it accountability at the get-go because there is a lack of engagement just based on that word. And I see Sitali's turned on his video, so I'll hurry up. But I think that's another piece. And then I would say that legislative bodies and members of parliaments are really important partners. So if there's a way to leverage their sort of role as elected officials within the system, it's actually good to have them there. And then the non-traditional partners I was mentioning are things like budget advocacy groups, debt-focused groups who actually have a role to play in prioritizing and recommending, I think, the more judicious use of resources. And that's a very important partner to do. And next slide, please. I think it would be one of my last slides. Yep, so Q&A, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Nisha, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your presentation and also your own experiences touching on Ethiopia and other places. For me, I think the biggest take home is that slide with the maze, which just shows there's no sequence. It's not a clear path, and you have many entry points, and you can start now. And find those different entry points. So I think people are taking a lot from this conversation. And interestingly, there are a lot of comments which shows that people are engaging with the content. There was no specific question per se. So thanks for really making a very clear presentation. And I think there will be more to discuss in the groups. So we will be getting into the breakout sessions. But Nisha, if you could just go through the chat, see if there are additional comments or points that you want to make on some of the comments that we've seen there, I think that will be great. So going into the breakout sessions now, just a little bit of background. we were really keen to understand how SWA CSO partners are engaging in climate finance discussions at the national level. So for us to have that understanding, we launched a survey within the constituency. Our sample size was 25 CSOs across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The selection was based on the institutional knowledge of this SWA CSO partners working at the intersection of WASH and climate, or the partners engaged in the integration of WASH and climate action. So we're really looking at partners that are in that intersection of WASH and climate action. Some CSOs were also sent the survey from countries that have received climate finance through global or bilateral entities based on desk research. We will go through, we will be in 3 breakout rooms, 2 in English and 1 in French. These breakout rooms will also discuss some of the case studies that came from through this survey. If you speak French and by mistake you have been put in English or in an English breakout session, please come back to the main room and we can assign you again the group that you need to be, and vice versa. If you speak English, you end up in a francophone group, just come back to the main group. And now we will ask our team to open the breakout sessions, and wishing all of us a good discussion in the breakout sessions. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you had really good discussions in the breakout sessions. I joined 2, the Francophone and also group, the first English group, and they were all really insightful discussions. So I hope that there's a lot that we can take out of this conversation today. So at this point, we will go to the 3rd part of our discussion, which was on the tools and resources that are available. And I'll straight away ask our colleagues at WIN to take us through this conversation. Just note that we are really behind time, so if we can be very quick on this, then that will enable us to close on time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sitali. Yeah, I think what we want to do basically is like share some of the resources and tools that are at the moment available that CSOs can benefit from. And obviously, we can always discuss this bilaterally later and how different organizations can support. So if you move to the next slide. So I'm talking about like from our organization, the Water Integrity Network, we have been working with quite a few tools which are like helpful in, let's say, building institutional integrity, supporting organizations on strengthening their processes, etc. So our tools are mostly, they're practical, they are participatory, data-driven, adaptable. What I'd like to mention is that like also they are very useful for in relation to multi-stakeholder context. How can you address issues when it is involving different stakeholders? We have very specifics within our tools, and that's something probably you will be able to share when you visit our website, and probably Daniela, you can put a link to our tools website. So please, next slide. So what we try to look at, because the conversation today has been looking more at like how do you strengthen integrity, how do you build accountability. I think there is one set of tools, what we call our assessment tools. We need to understand, we need to assess what is the situation, like what are the kind of integrity risks that exist that you need to deal with. And this is an evolving portfolio for us. We have a couple of tools here, like the annotated water integrity scan, which is very useful when you are trying to understand the basics of basic issues around integrity, and especially involving different stakeholders. We have been working a lot with urban water utilities, and something which we did not touch today, we did not discuss much, but very importantly, when it comes to WASH, we also need to consider empowering CSOs to be able to address issues of urban water and sanitation, because informal settlements is one space where a lot of the communities are coming, vulnerable communities who are facing climate, affected by climate change. Then there are management tools, what we consider, like how can we help organization, how can we probably help CSOs, like how to strengthen the systems. And we are also trying to start looking at tools which can help you in project design. And also probably there are other tools, for example, around budget tracking that has been in place for quite some time. How do we apply to climate finance? Something we should try to elaborate on as we move along. We have a tool for communities. You can see it's mentioned there. That's very useful for communities, how to empower communities to be able to support projects related to water and sanitation. How can they actually be able to be part of decision making? How can they monitor, etc.? So this is there. If you go to the next slide, please. So one thing which we would like to specifically point out is also like the need for gender and inclusion. This is something which is always missing in the climate discourse. I mean, there is some talk about it, but at WIN, we are trying to also address this more practically. We are developing specific tools or risks, identifying risks related to gender and inclusion. Next slide, please. And apart from WIN, I mean, there are other tools. There are numerous tools which are there, and I just wanted to highlight a few of them here. For example, there is the when you are mentioning like where can we go if we know some wrongdoing. I think this was some question which is coming. There is the Advocacy and the Legal Advices Center, which is supported by the Transparency International. A lot of the countries have that center called ALAC Center, and they can be approached for this. There are different kinds of other tools, like there is the climate finance tracking tool from Transparency International Mexico, which has been applied in other countries also, like in Bangladesh, where they look at like where the finances are going. There is also a tool related to infrastructure. And then there are also a newly, I think this is a useful one, which is coming from Helvetia Swiss Intercorporation. It's a training manual for CSOs and climate change. I think that might be a very useful one as a start. And then obviously the SWA has the mutual accountability mechanism. That's also something important to consider, how mutually you can look at each other or building at each other's accountability. Next slide, please. I think that's the one, the SWA mutual accountability mechanism, which we are talking about. And I think some of our CSOs are already aware of it. I think that's all we have to share for the moment. If there is time, we can probably take some questions. What I wanted to mention is that, like, in terms of the tools that we have been working a lot in countries in Latin America. So a lot of our tools are available in English and Spanish. Some of them are available in French also. And also we have, for example, when we were working in Bangladesh, we have also translated our tools to Bengali. So we do try to make it very localized as required. Thanks. Sitali, up to you.
Thanks, Binayak. So I would just say a few things about the slide that people are seeing on the screen now, in part because there were questions or comments which referred to it, referred to the mutual accountability mechanism in the first, when you and Daniela made the presentation, as well as when Nisha made her presentation. Just for those who might be new to this, the SWA's Mutual Accountability Mechanism, or the MAM as it's popularly known, can work as a vehicle for aligning climate strategies, water and sanitation adaptation and mitigation priorities, as well as aligning with climate financing through the submission of climate-related commitments under this mechanism. So partners are encouraged to submit commitments, but I think it also helps with those early phases of the process, as people were asking how CSOs can be involved. Now, aligned with the objectives of this workshop, CSOs may wish to commit under the SWA's Mutual Accountability Mechanism to strengthen their participation in national climate adaptation projects and related financing to hold key decision makers accountable. So out of this workshop, you might even want to make a commitment that you will engage with different stakeholders to actually hold each other accountable. Examples of such commitments are those which flag integrity issues in water, sanitation, and hygiene, in climate finance, and also those that elaborate on the role of civil society actors, e.g. commitments to advocate for inclusive budgets and investment plans, for more participation to influence decision-making in early stages, as I had already stated. Now, ahead of the 2022 sector ministers meeting, 5 commitments linking water, sanitation and hygiene and climate action were tabled by CSOs. And you can see the examples, the example on the slide. And if you wish to understand more about the SWS Mutual Accountability Mechanism or the process to submit commitments, please do not hesitate to contact our colleague Anjani. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, Binayak, for also going through the different tools that exist. That was that was extensive. Thank you. As I was checking through the chat again, I see more comments than questions. So we will in fact just proceed to getting the remarks from our steering committee vice chair, Sareen Malik, who's also the executive secretary for ANU in Africa. So let me just see if this is a question. It would be useful to work with transparency. Again, another comment. And thank you so much, everyone. We really, really appreciate the input and comments. Sareen, let me pass the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sitali. Sitali, is it all right to just share just what has come out from these from the working groups?
You mean you would like to give a quick summary out of that?
Yeah, just a quick one. It's not been distilled fully into summary, but let me just go ahead and share with you a bit what has been coming out. So of course, that CSOs are not often aware of the climate funding proposals from their countries and sometimes even the WASH ministries. We know that absorption is a real problem. Challenges that there's a challenge linked with a strong focus of climate finance adaptation in infrastructure. And I think this is something we mentioned not enough in terms of advocacy. We also had lots of interest in the room on how civil society actors can be involved and what are the mechanisms, institutional capacity building, role of CSOs in mobilizing media, budget tracking, and role of CSOs and communities in building incentives. It was noted in another group that it is key to guarantee the participation of communities in the development and planning of climate projects. And from the French group, we also have that CSOs ensure the link between communities and funders, and not including them, of course, poses risks of disconnect and maladaptation. Funders must consider CSOs from the onset as a crucial partner to play a key role in helping government absorb funds, but also as watchdogs. And finally, there's a need to demonstrate and raise awareness of the work that is already being done by CSOs, encouragement to report and use reporting and compliant mechanisms, and finally, to use existing networks such as SWA and WIN to face challenges of fragmentation that have come up quite a bit. So I'm pretty sure that the Secretariat will share the final report for this webinar. But in terms of the closing remarks, first of all, thank you very much, SWA. Thank you very much, the Water Integrity Network, also for sharing these excellent tools, as always, and supporting the work that we generally do. Look, if there was a time that civil society really needed to prove that we are still relevant, I believe this is an excellent opportunity to do so. I know we always get asked questions, what is our role? But it seems pretty clear what our role is, especially in emerging issues such as climate financing and in the water sector and issues of adaptation. But also in terms of this, I think helps us strengthen our oversight and watchdog role, and demonstrating and showing that, yes, we have the capacities, and I said it in the other group, we have the tools and more tools have been given to us. We already have the activities, we have the networks, we have the convening power. So I think we're ready, and we're really hoping that after this, we're actually able to take some of these learnings and able to take what has been presented over here and mainstream that in our work, or at least to start mobilizing around the issues of climate financing. So in terms of making sure, how do we engage? I think it was said that, yes, it's a very opaque sector, there's no doubt about it. But we do have the ability and the tools and the capacity to actually engage and push. We have the ability to raise awareness on these various issues. We're so smart at doing our accountability reports and our social audit reports and our campaigning. We should take this and I think just move it into this particular sector. And I'm confident that if we do so, we will attract financing or the resources necessary to continue with our work, but also solidify our positions as civil society organizations as being watchdog, as being the voice for the voiceless, and really ensuring that no one is left behind. So it is our hope and our hope and that this actually is taken further, of course, within our work. And on that note, thank you all very much. Absolutely, Shah Nasir, I agree. We should have these CSOs and these webinars a lot more often. Move forward towards, yes, the commitments that Sitali was talking about, but also a lot more in terms of educating ourselves on this particular sector. I thought we got wonderful slides today to show us, how does this sector actually work? How is it that we can actually engage? And I'm hoping ourselves as networks, the networks that are here present as well today, that we are able to mobilize our members to move forward with these activities. And yet again, thank you very much to all of you. And Sitali, should I hand it over back to you, or we're good?
Thank you so much, Sarin. Really appreciate that. You going back to the breakout sessions and then giving us some really good pointers in terms of what we could do next. And you brought in also a point from Shah Nasir about making this a regular conversation. So I'd like to just thank you, Sarin, and also thank the other speakers that we've had today, Jose, Daniela, Vinayak, Nisha, and also the moderators in the different breakout sessions. We are extremely grateful also to the partners that have contributed to making this a success, Water Integrity Network, World Resources Institute. And then we also had a number of CSOs that responded to the survey, and that made the case studies that we reviewed in the breakout sessions possible. So a really huge thanks. And from SWA, we're happy to play this role. And as we get into next year, we'll still be doing some work on climate. So let's see what next actions can be in this area. In case there are any questions on the mutual accountability mechanism or any clarity questions you may need on additional steps, please do not hesitate to get in touch with Anjani. Thank you very much, everyone, and do have a good day. Thank you.